What makes a speedrun fun? It could be movement or maybe glitches. The answer is going to change depending on who you ask, but whatever it is that you personally like, a good speed game will always be a reliable source of comfort, and there's not a lot of those left. Whether it be terrible patches, battle passes, or most frustratingly, sunsetting, speedrunning can keep otherwise obsolete games alive. You might not like the newest Valorant character, but you could be sure that Super Mario 64 will always be fun. Or can you? Picture this, you're about to start your speedrun, but suddenly your backwards long jump is looking more like a blindfolded backflip. What's going on? Did Nintendo patch the game? It sounds ridiculous, but this was the reality for Japanese speedrunners in 2009. Nintendo decided to release a special edition onto the Wii Virtual Console that fixed many of the glitches used in speedruns. This single decision is one of the main reasons competitive SM64 is still on the N64 and not later releases to this day. Manufacturers couldn't just ship out new copies every month, so before online updates, a game could only have so many revisions. So a developer would need to hold some crazy vendetta against speedrunning for them to keep repeatedly patching the game. One such developer seemingly does hold that grudge though. With the newly released remaster on Switch, Metroid Prime now has 10 versions, and in each iteration, the developers attempted to stop speedrunners, but they never could. The Metroid series has always encouraged speedrunning on some level. On the NES, players get a special reward when they complete the game in under 3 hours. Super Metroid displays your completion time before the credits, and Fusion has alternate endings for each hour-marked break. These games naturally encourage routing and expertise through these rewards, and like other entries, many players jumped into Metroid Prime to see how fast they could go. Despite its admittedly clunky controls, practice and patience can take you from slowly walking through rooms to zipping through entire areas without even looking at where you're going. You can even make a strong argument that Metroid Prime was the first modern speedrun. In 2004, yes, 2004, Smiling Jack had achieved a 1 hour, 13 minute any percent time, which is still respectable by today's standards. In this run, he shows a solid understanding of the fundamental techniques that make Metroid Prime such a great speed game. Slope jumps, scan dashing, LNR jumping, bomb space jumps, L-lock spring space jumps, bunny hopping, you name it, it's here. This potential skill cap created a competitive environment similar to what was seen in Super Mario 64, both games being tough to master, but with a clear road to follow for anyone who owned a physical copy of the game. Pretty soon, this would all change. Much like the Shindo release of Super Mario 64, over the next 10 years, sometimes multiple times a year, changes would be made to specifically stop what speedrunners were doing, even if those changes were at the detriment to casual players. The first domino to fall was scan dashing. One of the main features of the Metroid Prime series is its storytelling through objects and creatures that you can scan in the game. Scanning is used for anything from opening doors to lore explanations or even hints on boss weaknesses, but it has an unintended side effect that's useful for speedruns. The Prime games use what's commonly known as tank controls, where holding the control stick forwards or backwards moves Samus, while left and right spin her in place. However, this control style is known to make combat extremely difficult. To rectify this, holding the L button will lock Samus's view to her facing direction, allowing her to move in any direction at full speed. Now, if you're locked onto an enemy and tap the B button, Samus will dash to the side as a way to dodge an oncoming attack. This is also true when the player is using the scan visor. If the player cancels their lock-on during the first few frames of a dash, they'll be able to preserve that speed from the dash, not only allowing incredibly fast movement, but also some major sequence breaks, most notably Space Jump First. Getting the Space Jump boots is one of the largest backtracks in the game, having players find the boost ball in Phendrana Drifts, only to have them trek all the way back to Landing Site, the first room of the game, to get the Space Jump. However, Samus's ship sits at the perfect height to allow players to scan dash off of it onto this ledge and obtain the space jump as their first item, streamlining the route considerably. This sequence break is so well known that it escaped early forum posts, making it onto magazines. It's so large of a skip and so famous that it likely inspired the complete removal of dashing while using the scan visor starting on the PAL version of the game. This is quite the radical change, since it doesn't only affect speedruns, but completely changes how a casual player interacts with the game. As we mentioned before, scanning is a fundamental way the player is meant to get information about this world. But now scanning during a combat situation is incredibly dangerous. If an enemy attacks you while scanning, instead of dashing away, you just do this silly little jump. This version also introduced other changes that not only would slow down speedruns, but would just make the game harder. Vision Metroids were added around phase-on mines, Ridley's AI was changed, adding more attacks and making him immune to the boost ball, which previously could take out 2/3 of his health. Metroid Prime's Essence, security drones, and baby Shigas were all given significantly more health, and several enemies were given immunity to power bombs and missiles. On top of that, they also forced getting the power bombs before the grapple or plasma beams by adding rubble in front of their doors. This introduced even more problems for speedrunners and casual players alike. Metroid Prime does not have a dynamic drop system like most games you're used to. If you're low on power bombs or missiles, tough luck, enemies only have specific drops. This creates a situation where you could do a long puzzle, finally get to the end of it, then the door is covered with bendezamine and you're out of power bombs, so now you have to search the entire world for a power bomb drop, something that's frustrating to casuals and completely detrimental to a speedrun. Maybe they should have used Prime 3's name for this type of rubble. By 2008, when Metroid Prime was released on the Wii, it seems like the developers got frustrated, sticking invisible walls all over the place covering early access to phase-on mines and Flagra. They even changed how bomb jumping works by nerfing your forward momentum and limiting you to only one bomb being active in the air at a time. This was huge since it effectively patched early Artifact of Wild, one of the largest sequence breaks in the game that used continuous bomb jumping to skip the spider ball and super missiles. But doesn't Retro love speedrunners? They've notably had former developers expressing their personal love for speedrunning publicly. They'll answer questions on Twitter and have appeared on Games Done Quick. While that's likely true, these patches tell a different story. Almost all of these changes make the casual experience harder, if not worse, in an attempt to block players from experiencing the game outside of their intended sequence. When confronted about these patches, former Retro Studios developer Zoid Kirch said,
"The reason we modified it in later versions was for tuning reasons and because of some of the bugs that occur when sequence breaks happen. Like I said, that crash that I remembered was related to one of the locks. I think that's the lock on the door to the first room in the phase-on mines, the door on the right. In later versions, there's a lock on that."
I won't claim that Zoid is lying here, but it certainly isn't true. In the long list of changes that were made to Metroid Prime while he was working at the studio, only 2 address crashing at all, and only tangentially. One of those is fixing the infinite speed glitch that could be used to get anything from missiles to Chozo artifacts early. The other was fixing loading crashes that occurred when the game was being played on a GameCube. Infinite speed is a complex glitch that requires getting the morph ball stuck in a very specific way and charging up speed for nearly a minute. It's primarily used to get the artifact of Sun without plasma beam and an early power bomb expansion. Crashing the game with this is rare. I've never personally seen it, and this isn't something that a casual player would come across anyway. Despite what Zoid might say, sequence breaking was clearly in mind when patching the game, even in cases where it was irrelevant. Not too far into the phase-on mines, in ore processing, a trigger was added to alert the wave pirate on the top floor if the player entered from main query. This is a weird change, considering you aren't supposed to enter the room from there, with later versions adding a lock to that door to prevent players from using glitches to get there. The strangest part is that later versions removed both of these changes anyway. With all that being said, were these patches successful? In short, kinda, but definitely not to the extent that Nintendo may have wished. Metroid Prime Remastered should theoretically be Nintendo's ultimate achievement, where everything is fixed and the Metroid Prime experience is the same for every player. For a couple weeks, that seemed to be the case. Speedruns were using the natural route of the game, doing tons of backtracking to get items, and saving the hunt for the Chozo artifacts until the end of the run. This was easily the most limited version of the game, as it seemingly applied all previous patches and patched what is probably the most quintessential Metroid Prime glitch, out of bounds. Traditionally, every room in the Prime games is inside of a metaphorical box. This box, known as the Aether, is the boundary of where physics exists. Inside of the box, Samus can jump and fall, whereas outside of the box, she can only walk around and will slowly float up. The Aether made out-of-bounds movement, or secret worlds, extremely powerful, allowing you to go basically wherever you want by navigating the Aether to gain or lose height at will, notably being used to get the Ice Beam and Power Bombs early. Remastered gets rid of the box, making physics always apply to Samus no matter how far out of bounds she is, so traveling between rooms becomes far more limited. Additionally, they also added a failsafe for when Samus isn't inside of a room. If you hold a direction on the control stick on any collision outside of the room's collision, Samus will be popped back in bounds. And if you fall out of bounds, She'll die.
Good time loss.
However, with a lot of community effort, more and more sequence breaks from previous versions were being rediscovered, and the times dropped with it. Even though they had long since patched scan dashing, Space Jump could still be your first item. Traditionally, that would be done by just targeting an enemy instead of scanning. However, it's not quite as simple as this. The Switch port is primarily based on the Trilogy Wii release of Metroid Prime rather than the PAL or Japanese release of the GameCube version. This version not only kept the scan dashing change, but also nerfed dashing in general, making it so your speed is lost almost immediately. This can't be avoided, but we could work around it with a technique known as extended dashing. By dashing to the ground, then immediately performing a second dash when Samus touches the ground, you'll carry over the speed from the first dash into the second. Then, by holding what's known as a soft input, you could preserve that speed, giving you just enough space to make this jump. We aren't home free yet though. As we mentioned earlier, Remastered carries over a lot of the movement nerfs introduced on the Wii version. This change makes it extremely difficult to cross any gap even with an extended dash. However, they conveniently added a standable ledge here that doesn't exist on any other version of the game. The collision is higher than it looks, thankfully it's sloped, so with some careful movement, we can still land here and walk very slowly to make it to the space jump. On its own, this considerably streamlines the route, getting rid of huge backtracks between Talon Overworld and Phendrana Drifts. But we aren't finished yet. There are still some major backtracks to contend with, even if we get the space jump early. With the addition of bendezamine in front of doors in this version, getting power bombs as early as possible is extremely important. However, the most common way to get a power bomb early was to grab this expansion in Magma Pool. With Infinite Speed and the Aether both being removed, this expansion just won't be possible to get early on the Switch. However, just because a specific secret world was patched, that doesn't mean they all were. In fact, practically none of the methods of getting out of bounds were patched, only scan dashing and the Aether were removed. So, a secret world that doesn't require abusing the physics engine will still work. So let's look for another expansion to get. Down here in Magmar Caverns, underneath the Artifact of Strength has a power bomb. Normally you'd need to use a power bomb to get here, but conveniently, just outside of this room, there's an out-of-bounds clip that can be done with this Triclops. Through an incredibly precise sequence, you can actually get this guy to throw you out of bounds and carefully navigate standable collisions to get to the expansion. Funnily enough, getting this expansion early this way is actually impossible on other versions of the game, and only works because of the changes to out of bounds that forces Samus back in bounds when holding the control stick against the wall. We can also get the Ice Beam and Grapple Beam early with Secret Worlds, exploiting this same patch that was meant to keep players from going out of bounds. The most recently rediscovered Sequence Break also abuses changes made exclusively on the Switch version. In every Metroid Prime game, if the camera is obscured when Samus transitions from Morph Ball mode to her normal state, the transformation animation is skipped. This state has the unintended side effect of making Samus actionable immediately, and can be used to gain extra height on jumps with a technique known as Bomb or Spring Space Jump. In the original Metroid Prime, it's pretty hard to get this to happen, and can only be done in specific spots with specific setups. However, with each new game, the amount of time the camera needs to be obscured was reduced. By Prime 3, normal movement through rooms will cause you to be in this state. They seem to have carried this over to Metroid Prime Remastered. This change allows you to BSJ and SSJ in places you never would have been able to do on other versions of the game. This includes right after the Flagra fight. After you defeat Flagra, the game forces you down a shaft that normally requires the Spider Ball and Super Missiles to climb back up. As you fall, a trigger is hit telling the game to change the state of the room from Get Varia Suit mode to Get the Artifact mode. In the GameCube version, you can hit this trigger and bomb jump back up the shaft to get the artifact early. But this was thought impossible once they instituted the one bomb and air rule. At least, until now. With an extremely precise SSJ, runners can now do this trick on Remastered, saving an insane amount of time over coming back here later. Whatever the intentions, fans of Metroid Prime speedruns can pick up whatever copy they find, look up resources, and have a pretty good time despite the version differences in said copy. Metroid Prime Remastered is probably the most patched version of the game, yet its speedrun is great despite all the changes. Draconev recently finished the first any% speedrun with Space Jump first in it, and likely plans to do another with early Artifact of Wild in the future. Mr. Miguel released a task on the Wii version that features skips that haven't even been done on the GameCube version before. None of these changes ruined the game or ruined the speedrun. They've created a different run. This is one of the rare games with multiple patches that can be enjoyed this way. And do you really need anything else? This has been Zalux. Thank you for watching Lowest Percent.